What's up guys, and welcome to the 1991 BMW E34 M5. This will be my second time driving an E34 M5, and this one has over 250,000 miles on it. I included a lower mileage E34 M5 in an M5 comparisons video that I shot earlier this year. You can find that on the channel. And my overall takeaway is that while I love the way the E34 looks, from a driving dynamic standpoint, it's so clearly less advanced than the later E39 generation. And that's why the E39 is still my all-time favorite M5. It blends the classic BMW feel and look along with more modern driving dynamics. So is that still the case after I drive an E34 for the second time? The owner, Byron, mentioned that this only has a couple of mods on it, including this very classy Kenwood head unit. But in terms of driving dynamics, this has H&R lowering springs, adjustable Koni shocks, and aftermarket sway bars. A few specs about the E34. Because in the US we never got the later 3.8-liter engine, we have the 3.5-liter naturally aspirated inline-six. It's the S38 engine. It makes 310 horsepower, 265 foot-pounds of torque. This car was only offered with a 5-speed manual transmission, and this car weighs a little over 3,800 pounds. We have strut front suspension, semi-trailing rear suspension, and overall, this car just looks and feels very old. Not in a bad way per se, but I wouldn't go so far as to call this interior a timeless design. I'm really not a fan of this 4-spoke steering wheel. The diameter is almost comically large. I think the E39 M5 with its 3-spoke smaller diameter wheel just feels so much better. But let's take this thing for a drive and talk about where this stacks up in the world of BMW M5s. The throws on this 5-speed manual, comically long. The lateral motion actually is fairly short, but the longitudinal action, let me look at this first to second gear. You have to really pull your elbow back to engage second. Very slow steering ratio, being an early 90s car. Let's see how this S38 sounds at full throttle. Oh wow, this transmission, you gotta be patient with it. This car is a boat in the corners. There's so much body roll, even with the lowering springs and Koni shocks and sway bars. But it's not so much that makes this car difficult to handle in the corners. It's actually the steering. The on-center steering feel is so sloppy. Nothing happens about 5-6 degrees to either side of center. And then once you do get the steering loaded up, it gets extremely heavy, but not in a good way necessarily. There's a lot of weight, but not a ton of feedback, which is kind of surprising for a 35-year-old car. You would expect this to have better steering feel. The rest of the driver controls are very much in line with the steering, at least. I already mentioned the long shifter throws, but also this throttle pedal. It's floor mounted and it has a very long travel. And at the top of the pedal, there's a little bit of a sticking point that you have to overcome. The benefit is that you actually have very fine-tuned control over the throttle, but again, it's not something that likes to be rushed. All the controls of this car, you have to be very deliberate with. Even the clutch has a long throw. The brakes, thankfully, feel okay. Not much of a learning curve there. Now this S38 engine has plenty of mid-range torque, but it's not exactly a rever. It's not an engine that really begs you to wind it out to its 7,000 RPM redline. Even though the E34 M5 was the quickest, highest performing sedan ever when it came out, nowadays its performance does feel very dated. In a straight line, I think this is rated at sub 6 seconds for 0 to 60. I think closer to 5.5, but you wouldn't know that from behind the wheel. Part of that could be because we're at elevation here. This naturally aspirated engine is suffocating a bit. Also with this 5-speed gearbox, the gearing is quite long. Comfortable seats, they don't do a great job of holding you in, but actually better than my brand new Integra Type S seats in terms of the side bolstering. But this is definitely not a downhill canyon car. We're doing it because we can, but this is not this car's forte by any means. This is definitely more of a cruiser. Right there is where I actually do appreciate the long throw throttle pedal. Coming out of a third gear sweeper, when you just want to add little bits of throttle application, you don't want a super sensitive on-off switch that can upset the car. Once you get into a groove with this car, it's pretty easy to drive. You just have to know how to anticipate its lazier responses. I'm trying to keep up with this E92 M3 right now. I'm pretty sure I'm working way harder than he is. If only this car had better steering. I believe this is recirculating ball versus a rack and pinion, and so the on-center feel is just sorely lacking. You notice that the most through the S-curves, when you go left to right or vice versa, there's so much dead zone that you have to actually turn in quicker or earlier than you otherwise would. But the refinement of this 35-year-old sedan is actually quite good. Not much wind noise, barely any squeaks and rattles. The interior actually feels pretty well built, especially for 258,000 miles. That's insane. Byron did mention that the engine was rebuilt at some point. There's so much of a delay from when you turn the steering wheel until the suspension actually sets. You just gotta turn in early into every corner. Not something you have to do with the E39 M5. That car feels so much more advanced in terms of its driving dynamics. Very much analog still, with good steering feel, very communicative chassis. This just feels archaic, but that's okay, because the E34 in 2024 is not a canyon carver. No one buys it nowadays, or still has one, expecting it to excel in this type of driving. This is a quaint sports sedan. You just feel so cool cruising around in it. I honestly don't feel compelled to even rev this engine out. It actually sounds good in the lower half of the rev range. You have that characteristic BMW straight six smoothness, very direct throttle response, and you can really learn to enjoy the slower inputs, the long shifter throws, the slower steering. Once you get into a groove with this car, driving just at normal speeds, that's actually where this car is the most enjoyable. It feels like we just hopped back in time 35 years. But it still gives you a relatively modern amount of performance. I mean, 310 horsepower, plenty of modern cars don't have that much power. So big shout out to Byron for letting me experience my second E34 M5. Let me know how you think this car stacks up against the other M5 generations. And how about the other German sports sedans of this era? How do you think this stacks up against contemporary Mercedes and Audis? Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.